A little bit later than Perelandra, Lewis is involved in a debate at Oxford. It's the Oxford Socratic Club, I believe, which he founded or refounded. It had existed prior to Lewis, but then when he joined the faculty at Oxford in the late 20s, he revived it. And the debate was between himself and a philosopher, a Catholic philosopher named Elizabeth Anscombe. You could read about this. I mean, just do an internet search for Lewis Anscombe debate. Anscombe. The debate was over logical proofs of the existence of God. Okay? Because Anscombe disagreed with some of what Lewis had written in Mere Christianity about the ontological proof of God. And I'm not going to go into all this, all the terminology and stuff. When the debate finished, according to Lewis's closest friends who have written about what happened afterwards and in biographies of Lewis, according to Lewis's closest friends and to Lewis, essentially, he thought she swept the floor with him. He thought he failed miserably. He thought he lost and lost greatly. Okay? When that judgment was passed on to Elizabeth Anscombe, she was quite surprised. She did not think that was at all what happened. She didn't think that she had lost, but she thought of it or looked at it almost more as a tie, that it was just two great minds having this great theological, logical discussion. Okay? But Lewis, let me put it this way. Interestingly, after that, Lewis no longer wrote Christian apologetics. He no longer tried to defend rationally the Christian faith. He still wrote things like letters to Malcolm chiefly on prayer or reflections on the Psalms. That is, he wrote works of theological interest, but he wasn't trying to prove the truth of Christianity anymore. Not by reason alone, at least. Okay? That debate, if I remember right, that occurred in 1947 or 48. Well, he writes Chronicles of Narnia, first one, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, in 1950. Okay? That is a huge break. That is, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe is a huge break from any of the other stuff he had written before then. Because even in his other fiction, Screwtape, the Ransom or Space Trilogy, Pilgrim's Regress, The Great Divorce, those are all, well, let me exclude the Space Trilogy. The others, Screwtape, The Great Divorce, Pilgrim's Regress, are all clear allegories. Okay? Where he wants you to read one thing as a stand-in for something else. Space Trilogy is not as clearly an allegory, but it has clear allegorical episodes or parts. That is, Ransom is clearly an allegory of Christ, at least in Perelandra. You have the whole passage where my name is also Ransom, your name's not an accident, da-da-da-da-da. Okay? Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe is not an allegory. Aslan is not Christ. Okay? Even though I know he's the son of the emperor over the sea. How do we know he's not Christ? If he were an allegory, and he were supposed to be an allegory of Christ, what would there need to be in the novel? Virgin birth. Mary is nowhere in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. Neither are the apostles or disciples. Okay, not at all. So it doesn't work as an allegory. Lewis referred to it as a supposal. Okay, he supposed what would the incarnation, or what would the central message of Christianity look like if it happened in a world populated by talking animals. Okay, and this is what he came up with. But even there, the real impetus for writing Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe wasn't theology, wasn't Christianity. It was because he'd been having dreams since the 30s. And in these dreams, he had recurring images. For example, a fawn carrying an umbrella over his arm, with his tail also lopped over his arm, and walking with an armful of packages in the snow. A great tawny lion. And he never knew what the images meant until he started writing Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. And then, as almost all writers say, the story took over, and it just kind of wrote itself. And the image of the fawn became Mr. Tumnus, the tawny lion became Aslan, etc. Okay? He then goes on and writes all 7 Chronicles of Narnia. Last one published, I think, 55, something like that. Okay? During this period that he's writing Chronicles of Narnia, might not even be 57, might be earlier than that. He meets Joy Davidman Gresham. First, he meets her by post. She starts writing him letters. She's married. She's a former atheist. In fact, she's a former atheist communist. All right. Her husband's Jewish. And she starts writing to him. And from some sources, Lewis kind of considers her at first as a pest. She eventually, I think 54 or 55, she moves to England. She and her husband are going through a bad patch. They're on their way to divorce. She moves to England. She moves to London. But she wants to be closer to Lewis. There's nothing romantic going on. Okay? She moves to Oxford. They start to meet, and they fall in love. You can watch the dramatized version of this in The Shadowlands. Don't watch the Anthony Hopkins, Deborah Winger version. Watch the Joss Ackland, Claire Bloom version, which is the stage version.
I haven't seen the Anthony Hopkins version. I have seen the Joss Ackland version.
The Joss Ackland version is fantastic.
It is, yeah. My question is, what's the difference between the two?
Well, obviously, the film version with Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger, for lack of a better way of putting it, it's more Hollywood. The Joss Ackland version is BBC. Okay, and I'll just put it this way: it's more accurate. Okay, the script is essentially by the same person, a guy by the name of William Nicholson, who's a fantastic, just throw this out there also, novelist, writer of fantasy fiction. It's sometimes characterized as young adult. I don't think it's young adult at all. Nicholson, is an interesting person in his own right. Get on his website and he talks about his kind of beliefs and everything. He is his terms, lapsed Catholic. My terms, who very much wants to believe. He wants, like more than anything else, something to believe in. He doesn't believe in Christianity anymore, but he hasn't found anything else to replace it with. And so when you read his fiction, it's so clear. There's this big gaping hole that he wants to fill. And so what does he fill it with? He fills it with all kinds of Christian imagery. Okay? But he wrote or co-wrote the screenplay for Shadowlands. He's also the co-writer of Gladiator, and a couple of other fairly big films. The Joss Ackland Claire Bloom version also, I think, gives you a better feel for Lewis in Joy. Okay, Anthony Hopkins. It's too hard to separate Anthony Hopkins from C.S. Lewis. And in the Anthony Hopkins version, for some reason, the director has Lewis going around and repeating a line from The Problem of Pain. And the line is, "Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world." And what they do in that film is they have Lewis giving these talks. And he keeps quoting himself. He keeps throwing that out there. If I remember correctly, the Joss Ackland Claire Bloom version does not do that at all. And from my understanding of Lewis's life, read a few biographies, he never did that. He didn't go out and quote himself. For the simple reason, Lewis quoted what he referred to as the greats. He quoted the giants of medieval and Renaissance and classical literature. And he never put himself up on their level. Okay? So, he meets Joy in the mid-50s. In 56 or 57, she is diagnosed with bone cancer, if I remember correctly. And they have a quickie wedding at the hospital. The wedding is because it's not thought that she's going to live. Okay? This wedding, by the way, exacerbated a rift that had come between Lewis and Tolkien. Okay? 1954, Lewis left Oxford, become chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University. The position was made solely for him. It was made for him because he was turned down for a similar chair at Oxford that Tolkien had nominated him for, and then several other people. He apparently was turned down at Oxford because of his Christian writings, because of his Christian apologetics. The Faculty of English didn't want him. Okay? And Cambridge said, "My God, you people, you are fools." And so they created this position for him, which he held for several years before he had to retire because of bad health. After this kind of quickie hospital ceremony, well, let me go back for just a second. The rift that the marriage exacerbated began in the mid to late 40s. It kind of began with Perelandra and That Hideous Strength, okay? Or it didn't begin then, but that signaled a break between them. Because for Tolkien, Lewis was too, how do I want to put this? Too argumentative, too philosophical, or too theological. He was trying to prove a point too much. Okay? And then Lewis starts writing, the Chronicles of Narnia. And for Tolkien, that kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back. Because he thought the Chronicles of Narnia were way too allegorical and not good fiction. Okay? Very first novel, Tolkien really did not like, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, because Lewis broke a cardinal rule of writing, one that Tolkien writes about or discusses in the Fairy Story essay. He introduces a huge anachronism. Who shows up in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe that doesn't belong in Narnia?
Santa Claus.
Father Christmas. You can't have Father Christmas in Narnia. Why? There's no Christmas. It's always winter, we're told, and never Christmas. Well, of course there's never Christmas, because Christmas has never occurred in Narnia. Okay? Tolkien saw that as a huge flaw. Lewis didn't. Lewis didn't think it was a problem because what was Lewis doing? He's mixing myths together. Okay? Tolkien in Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, the whole Middle Earth saga, he's writing an entire new mythology. Does it have elements from other myths? Yes. But he doesn't bring in King Arthur and Excalibur. Instead, we get Aragorn and Andúril.
So Lewis wrote the space trilogy and then sort of positioned that as it's just the references to Numenor.
Yeah, he's got the reference to Numenor and Merlin. Okay.
I just think it's interesting because he's kind of in some way forcing King Arthur onto Tolkien's mythology.
Well, but Tolkien's mythology does allow for that. I mean, if you read all of the Middle Earth material, you see how Tolkien's mythology is behind, ultimately, King Arthur and Ing of the Germanic tribes. Okay. So when Lewis marries Joy Davidman, okay, she's a divorcee. She is Christian by this point, but for Tolkien's Catholic mindset, he can't allow that. So that creates a pretty strong break in their relationship. But one thing happens quickly after this marriage. It's not clear from the biographies. It's not clear, I should say, from some of the biographies. Some of the biographies say otherwise. That when Lewis marries Joy Davidman Gresham on her hospital bed, that he loves her. They do later have a Church of England wedding. This was a civil wedding. Then they have a Church of England wedding. It's very clear that by the time of the Church of England wedding, Lewis is head over heels madly in love with this woman. Okay? And then she dies in 1960. Okay? They have the one wedding, and then she has a remission. Not because of chemotherapy and all that. She goes into remission and has about 4 years of relatively good health. They get to do something Lewis had always wanted to do and never done before, and something Joy had wanted to do and never done before. They take a tour of Greece. Okay? They tour the Greek Isles. They go to Delphi and they go to Athens. They go to some of the places. Keep in mind, Lewis's degree at Oxford was a first in greats. What does that mean? Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Aeschylus, Euripides. Okay? He was fluent in the ancient Greek writers. And so he finally got to visit the place where they all lived and walked and taught and wrote and all that kind of stuff. They come back and she dies fairly quickly. I think that's spring of 1960 that they do that trip, and she's dead by the end of the year. Okay? When she dies, that just about breaks C.S. Lewis. And he writes a little book under a pseudonym, N.W. Clerk. Okay? The Clerk is a family name. The pseudonym is titled A Grief Observed. Okay? Notice the title. A Grief Observed. Like, let's use Tinadrill. Like stepping outside of yourself and looking at the alongside. A grief observed is just like that. It is someone who is going through tremendous grief, kind of stepping aside and observing it. Okay? And what do we see? Do we see Lewis the calm, cool, rationalist Christian? No. We see somebody who is madly, deeply in love, who's had his wife ripped away from him. And he is angry at God. He calls God, the great vivisector. Vivisection is dissecting. Okay? And he says God takes pleasure in vivisection, in dissecting, in cutting people open. And he gets to the point, early on where he says, why in the world would he bring her into my life if the reason was solely to take her out again. Not only is he a vivisector, he's cruel. He's a monster. Okay? But when you read the little thing, and it's only like 60 pages long or so, when you read through it and get to the end, what does he see? Or what conclusion does he come at? Yes, God intentionally brought her into his life. But what did she become too much of in his life?
God.
She became his sole focus. Okay? And she becomes, for Lewis, like Beatrice was to Dante. She becomes the means to be followed back to God. Okay? And if you've never read it before, I highly recommend you read it. It's very, very touching. It is so unlike anything else Lewis wrote. But I think it's kind of interesting because it's the last thing he wrote for publication. There are a couple of other books that were published after his death, okay, that he nearly finished. But this is the last thing he actually wrote. So you have this interesting arc or trajectory from about 1940 to about 1960. 1940, cool, cold, rational logic. 1960, it's almost more of what one writer called, and I'm trying to remember who this is, might be Corbin Scott Carnell, the feeling intellect. Because in A Grief Observed, he doesn't arrive at his conclusions out of pure cold logic. It's feeling. He's in touch with, I don't want to say emotions, because emotions is a loaded and simplistic word today. He's in touch with his heart. Okay? What the Greeks call his nous. It's kind of the seat of real knowing. Okay? The Greeks say, the Greek fathers of the church say, this is what you really learn or really use to learn about God. Because you don't learn about God. You learn God. This is the seat of experiential, let's say, knowledge or learning. Not the stupid kind of experiential knowledge we have at MTSU with the so-called EXL and all that kind of stuff. Okay, which is still about facts out there. Okay? This is transformative knowledge. Okay? Now, all of that is an introduction to Till We Have Faces. Why? Before Lewis met Joy Davidman Gresham, and after he finished writing Chronicles of Narnia, he went through a period when he couldn't write. He tried and tried and tried.
Wait, before he met Joy Davidman and after he finished writing Chronicles of Narnia?
Yeah.
But he dedicated The Horse and His Boy to Joy Davidman, not her son.
To David Gresham?
To Douglas Gresham.
Douglas Gresham, sorry. Okay. I just know in some of his letters, he talks about having a writer's block. Okay, so I guess it's after Chronicles of Narnia. He has writer's block, and it's only through talking with her that the writer's block is broken. She's the one who encourages him to actually turn to this story. This is a story Lewis had wanted to write since the 30s. And when I say this is a story, I mean a rewriting of the myth of Cupid and Psyche. I don't necessarily mean this exact story. Okay? He first read the myth of Cupid and Psyche, I think, I was just reading this today. I think when he was 18. And was really entranced by it. And he'd been trying from, I think it was early 30s to the early 50s to write about it. And he could kind of never find the right angle. Okay? And it's through conversations with Joy that he finds that right angle. Let's open your books to the first chapter. Notice how it begins. I am old now and have not much to fear from the anger of gods. I have no husband nor child nor hardly a friend through whom they can hurt me. My body, this lean carrion that still has to be washed and fed and have clothes hung about it daily with so many changes, they may kill as soon as they please. The succession is provided for. My crown passes to my nephew. Okay, so what's the opening paragraph tell us?
She's old. She's doesn't have anything to lose.
Okay, speaker's old. Speaker doesn't have anything to lose. Notice who it's from. The speaker doesn't have anything to lose.
Yeah.
The gods. Notice how she puts it. I have not much to fear from the anger of gods. I have no husband, child, nor friend through whom they can hurt me. So what is our first experience or introduction to the gods like? How are they portrayed?
Cruel.
Cruel, malicious,
Dangerous. Something else.
dangerous, uncaring. Notice, they may kill my body as soon as they please. So, being for all these reasons free from fear, I will write in this book what no one who has happiness would dare to write. Why would no one who has happiness dare to write this?
Because the happiness can be taken away.
Bingo. Because the gods can take away your happiness. How does, for those of you who are familiar with Sophocles, how does Sophocles finish Oedipus the King?
Having him wander out into the wilderness.
Yeah. I'm thinking of a particular line, though.
Oh,
Count no man happy
until he be dead.
until he is dead. Now, that's a pretty bleak take on life. Count no man happy until he is dead. So, to be alive on this earth is to what?
Have something to lose.
Or to be in pain. Okay?
Even in Oedipus, though, like he's happy until it all falls apart.
I would disagree. He's not happy.
Is he not?
No. He's always searching. That's why he always answers riddles. He always solves problems. He's always in the thick of things. Okay? Kind of like Socrates was. So, I will accuse the gods, especially the god who lives on the gray mountain. That is, I will tell all he has done to me from the very beginning, as if I were making my complaint of him before a judge. She uses that verb tell. Notice tell has two meanings. It means to speak about, but what else does it mean? Like a bank teller. To count, to enumerate. She's going to set down the whole list of debits she has against the gods. But there is no judge between gods and men, and the God of the mountain will not answer me. Terrors and plagues are not an answer. There is no judge between gods and men. What does she mean? Here you have the gods. Let me use what she uses. Here you have men. Okay? It's like they're on a balance. There's nobody up here to determine which side is right and which side is wrong. Because what will the gods do? We're right, you're wrong, you're not a god. Might makes right. Terrors and plagues are not an answer. Notice what she's saying. Terrors and plagues have been given as answers by the gods. Okay? What happens to Job when he questions God? I don't mean the first 30 chapters. I mean the last 7 or 8. When God appears in a whirlwind. What does God do? Job, let's sit down, pull up a chair. I'll tell you exactly why everything's happening to you. You see, Satan, the great adversary, came into my presence and he said, look at Job. And I said, yeah, look at Job. He's a great man. He's my friend.
Yeah, no,
He
doesn't
loves.
do any of that.
God doesn't do any of that. What does God do?
He-
Look at the snowflake, Job. Tell me where it came from. Look at Leviathan. Tell me how the stars hang in the heavens. Oh, you can't do any of that? What does Job take from that? Sorry. Don't mean to step on your toes, God. Now I understand. I am as nothing in your presence. Hubris. Okay? So, she goes on and talks about writing in Greek. Why? Because that's the way her old master taught her to write. She tells us who she is. I was, notice, Orual, the eldest daughter of Trom, king of Glom. She tells us where Glom sits. Notice, none of the descriptions she gives us mean anything to us until we're told that Glom sits where in our world? It's north of the Greek lands. Okay? They're barbarians, according to the Greeks. She talks about her sister, Redival, okay, and her youngest sister, I'm skipping several pages because I want to get through quite a bit. She talks about when her father brings a slave in to be a teacher. Page 6, now Greekling, I trust to beget a prince one of these days. I have a mind to see him brought up in all the wisdom of your people. Meanwhile, practice on them. Okay, Orual and Redival, or Redival. You'll hear that name pronounced differently. And notice what he says just before he leaves, or before he sends them away. Especially the elder, that's Orual. Why? See if you can make her wise. It's about all she'll ever be good for. Now, we haven't been told anything at this point about Orual from anybody else, have we? Everything's from her perspective, okay? So she goes on and talks about how much she loved the fox, as she called him. Okay? And she relates some of the stuff that she has learned from him. And he tells her, page 8, the story about how Aphrodite once fell in love with Anchises. And he cries as telling the story. Not that this ever really happened, says the fox in haste. It's only lies of poets, child. Not in accordance with nature. Why does he say it's lies of poets? The story of Aphrodite and Anchises. Or we could take any Greek myth or Greek poem. Go back to the fairy story essay. Okay? And the little poem that Tolkien includes in there. That's called Mythopoeia. And we have the line in there about lies breathed through silver. Okay, he was writing that to Lewis in the late 20s or early 30s. Lewis was the one who said poems and myths and novels even are nothing but lies of poets. They might be beautiful lies, but they are lies nonetheless. Why? Because Beowulf never lived. Achilles never lived. Aphrodite never lived. They aren't real in that sense. Okay? Not in accordance with nature. What does he mean? If we were to go back and examine the quote-unquote book of nature, that is, if we had a way to examine every artifact that has existed in nature, you would never find Aphrodite and Anchises. But he had said enough to let me see that if the goddess was more beautiful in Greece than in Glom, she was equally terrible in each. It was always like that with the fox. He was ashamed of loving poetry, and I had to work much at my own reading and writing and what he called philosophy in order to get a poem out of him. Notice, he loves this stuff. It's almost like he lives for it. And yet, it's not true. Kind of like what I was talking about William Nicholson earlier. Virtue, sought by man with travail and toil, was the one he praised most, etc. So they go on and she talks about what they would do during the summers and what they would talk about. Let's see here. Page 11. There's going to be a hymn. The priest is going to come through, etc. And the fox asks, are the young women, meaning the daughters, to be veiled or unveiled? Need you ask? Said the king with one of his great laughs, jerking his thumb in my direction. Do you think I want my queen frightened out of her senses? Veils, of course, and good thick veils. One of the other girls tittered, and I think that was the first time I clearly understood that I am ugly. Notice what Lewis does with verb tenses. This has all been written in the past. And I think that was the first time I clearly understood that I am ugly. Not that I was ugly. Am is now. Even though it's being described as in the past. The past ugliness continues. Okay? Look at the second to last paragraph at the end. I know now that the face I saw was beautiful. They were unveiling the king's new wife. But I did not think of that then. All I saw was that she was frightened, more frightened than I, indeed terrified. It made me see my father as he must have looked to her a moment since when she had her first sight of him standing to greet her in the porch. His was not a brow, a mouth, a girth, a stance, or a voice to quiet a girl's fear. And then she gets taken into the king's bedroom. How old is this girl? She's young. All right. I can say very little about my father's second wife, for she did not live till the end of her first year in Glome. She's with child. I'm going to skip a bunch. The girl, young queen, dies, and the king just starts yelling at the priest of Ungit, page 15. The priest noticed, the king's going berserk. And the priest listens to him, but the priest doesn't reply in kind. That is, he doesn't reply in a berserk fashion. He replies calmly, coolly, reserved. Ungit hears, king, even at this moment. And Ungit will remember, you have already said enough to call down doom upon all your descendants. Descendants. Who is the king thinking of when he hears that word descendants? Male children. Okay? He only has daughters. Girls, 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 and now one girl more. Is there no end to it? Is there a plague of girls in heaven that the gods send me this flood of them? And he grabs Orul by the hair, flings her from him. Okay. And we're told again there was dead silence in the hall. Suddenly the king flung up his hand, stamped, and cried, faces, faces, faces. He turns around and he sees all these people staring at him, gaping mouthed. Okay. So Orul and Redival leave with the fox. And Orul tells him, page 17, you should leave. The king will kill you. When he's like this, he's crazy. He says, no, that would be foolishness. And he says, there's only one way really for me to leave, and that's to commit suicide. She says, the poison? Why, yes. Don't cry. Have I not told you often that to depart from life of a man's own will, when there's good reason, is one of the things that are according to nature? That is, if you have a good reason, it is perfectly fitting to end oneself. We are to look on life as, and Arul interrupts them. They say that those who go that way lie wallowing in filth down there in the land of the dead. Shh. Are you still a barbarian? At death we are resolved into our elements. Okay. What does Arul say happens to you at death? If you kill yourself. You go to the underworld and you're punished. You're punished. Okay? Pretty standard in Greek mythology. What does he say? The fox.
Are you still a barbarian? Which suggests that even the Greeks.
Next line.
Oh,
At death we are resolved into our elements. There's nothing to go down to the underworld. There is no self anymore. There's no consciousness. There is no psyche. Okay? Arul. Oh, I know. But do you really in your heart believe nothing of what is said about the gods and those below? You do. You do. How does she know? You're trembling. He says up here, there's nothing after death. And yet, what does his body show? He is scared to death of death. And he says, that's my disgrace. The body is shaking. I needn't let it shake the God within me. Okay? And Lewis is probably playing on there of the Greek idea of the daimon or daemon, okay, which is use another word, the genius that each person has. It's kind of the guiding spirit. It's the thing within you, and for many of us, it's deep, deep, deep within you that is telling you what it is you are for in this world. That is what your purpose is in life, what you are meant to be or do. Have I not carried this body too long if it makes such a fool of me at the end? Okay? So he's trying to rationalize. There is nothing to fear death. There is nothing to fear death. There is nothing to fear death. And yet everything, every fiber of his being fears death. Okay? So, they burned the dead queen. The father names the young child Istra. And Arul tells us that that means Psyche in Greek. Okay. Psyche is a beautiful child, we're told, page 22. The years go by and she gets more and more and more beautiful. In fact, she tells us, middle of that paragraph on 22, she made beauty all round her. That is, wherever Psyche went, that place became beautiful. When she trod on mud, the mud was beautiful. When she ran in the rain was silver. When she picked up a toad, the toad became beautiful. Okay? And the fox at one point on page 23, they're outside for the day. Arul tells us at the top of the page that she wished that she could have been a wife so that she could have been the real mother for Psyche. And the longest paragraph in the middle of the page. We were often out all day in summer on the hilltop to the southwest, looking down on All Gloam and across to the gray mountains. We stared our eyes. We stared our eyes out on that jagged ridge till we knew every tooth and notch of it. For none of us had ever gone there or seen what was on the other side. Psyche, almost from the beginning, was half in love with the mountain. She made stories about it. When I'm big, she said, I will be a great, great queen, married to the greatest king of all, and he will build me a castle of gold in amber up there on the very top. Notice, Arul tells us that she is telling these stories from her earliest age. Okay, remember what I said about genius and the daemon? There's something inside Psyche telling her, this is what you are for. Okay? The fox, prettier than Andromeda, prettier than Helen, prettier than Aphrodite herself. Well, take Andromeda out for the moment, but whenever you say prettier than Helen and prettier than Aphrodite, Aphrodite doesn't like anybody to be prettier than her. You're calling down upon yourself trouble with the gods, which is why a rule says, speak words of better omen, grandfather. Now, who is Aphrodite in the myth of Cupid and Psyche? Cupid's mother. Okay. Here she's Ungit. She says, speak words of better omen, grandfather, for though I knew he would scold and mock me for saying it. For at his words, though on that summer day the rocks were too hot to touch, it was as if a soft, cold hand had been laid on my left side, and I shivered. Bye-bye, said the fox. It is your words that are ill-omened. The divine nature is not like that. It has no envy. Okay. What divine nature? Because according to the fox's teaching, is there any divine?
He's thinking of like a prime mover or something like that, or like I think Plato's like the good, or something like that.
I mean, that's possible. But what does he teach Arul throughout this novel? There are no gods. There is only what we can see and the virtues or the passions. Okay? So, chapter 3. It was Redival who ended the good time. Notice, she had always been feather-headed. Now, describe Redival as compared to Arul. She's a knockout. Okay? But what else about Redival? She's promiscuous. Okay? She had been promiscuous with Taran. And what happens to Taran? The king emasculates him. Okay? Turns him into a eunuch then and there. We find out how, this kind of cows Redival into a little bit better behavior. But what happens? As a result of her loose behavior, she now has to be with Arul and Arul and the fox wherever they go. Okay? So we're told, one day Redival, this is page 26, one day Redival hit Psyche. Then I hardly knew myself again till I found that I was astride of Redival, she on the ground with her face a lather of blood, my hands about her throat. Okay. The year after that I fought with Redival was the first of the bad harvests. King tries to get married again. They're trying to figure out kind of what's going on, page 27. She sees Psyche off at the edge of the royal gardens. Redival went after her. I had one eye on the pair of them and one ear for the fox. Then it seemed they were talking to someone in the lane. They came back and Redival says, why don't you honor the goddess? What do you mean? Did you not know our stepsister had become a goddess? What does she mean, Istra? Come on, stepsister goddess, speak up. And so what does Psyche say? All that happened was that a woman with child asked me to kiss her. But why? Because she said her baby would be beautiful if I did. In other words, that Psyche would impart some kind of grace to this child. And what did you do, Istra? I kissed her. She was a nice woman. I liked her. Notice, she doesn't think anything about it. And don't forget that she then laid down a branch of myrtle at your feet and bowed and put dust on her head. Okay, those are all signs of honor toward the gods. Has this happened before? Sometimes. Often? I don't know. Twice? More than that? 10? Well, more. I don't know. Maybe. Is it wrong? Is it wrong that people are bowing down before me and scattering dust on their heads like she doesn't realize? The fox, it doesn't matter. Okay. Rationally, logically, what you do for them and what they do to you makes no difference whatsoever. The divine nature is without jealousy. Those gods, the sort of gods you are always talking about, are all follies and lies of poets. He's making a distinction between the divine nature and the gods of the poets and dramatists and writers. So maybe there really is a divine nature. But notice that divine nature doesn't have a name, doesn't have a face, doesn't have a person attached to it. It's kind of like the Force. Okay? Redival, I wonder what Ungit thinks of our new goddess. It's not very easy to find out what Ungit thinks. Well, why not? What is Ungit? First of all, what is Ungit physically?
A rock.
A rock. Okay? But she's the goddess of gloom.
So that's not odd at all.
So the next year, there's a rebellion. The year after that, also there's a bad harvest. The fox fell sick, so Arul is now made a servant to the king, since she can read and write in Greek. So she works as a negotiator and translator and such. Psyche nurses the fox back to health. And what do the people start to do? Send out Istra, send out the princess. Why? They want healing. So the king says she'll have to go out. What does the fox think? It's ludicrous. Why send her out? She's just a little girl. What good will it do? Can she make medicines? Nope. Can she, quote unquote, perform miracles? Not according to his logic, she can't. Okay. Arul says to the fox, can she heal them? Did she heal you? The fox, it's possible. It might be in accordance with nature that some hands can heal. Who knows? Notice, it might be in accordance with nature, though. And what he seems to be saying there is, if we had enough time, we could figure out why, maybe, she was able to do the healing. All right?
It also kind of echoes a bit what they said towards the end of that hideous strength, that nothing goes against the natural order, not the real natural order.
Yeah.
Not things may appear to rub up against the accidents of the natural order, so to speak, but they even miracles.
Mm-hmm.
Something that he talks about in miracles, that even miracles are in accordance with the real order of the universe.
So Psyche goes out. She goes, page 32, like a child going to say a lesson, right in among all the foulness. She touched, they fell at her feet, kissed her feet, the edge of her robe, her shadow, the ground where she had trodden. Notice, these are all New Testament biblical examples of when people sought healing either from Christ or one of the disciples. Okay?
Of course.
For hours she touched. And Ariel says, King, it's going to kill her. He said, well, too bad. They'll kill us if she stops. Okay? So, around sunset it finishes, and Psyche is brought into her bed. She's carried. Top of 33. At her worst, there was no look of death upon her face. It was as if he dared not come near her. And when her strength came back, she was more beautiful than before. The childishness had gone. Why? What happened? Think of the unman's questioning of Tenedril, the Green Lady. And once he introduces into her mind that idea of vanity, of pride, what does Ransom begin to see in her face?
Kind of nobility, I guess is one way of putting it, like in the more classic sense of the word, you know?
Yeah, he sees a change in her. Why? Because she's kind of begun to live vicariously through the stories she has experienced without knowing what he's talking about. Okay? Psyche has what happened? She has experienced these people's illnesses. Where has she been most of her life? In the temple, in the palace. She hasn't been hobnobbing with the people. The fox says, terribly does she resemble an undying spirit, a goddess. Okay? Some of the people die, some recover. Going to chapter 4. Up till now, I had not known what the common people are like. Well, because she never spent time with them. That was why their adorings of Psyche, which in one way made me afraid, comforted me in another. For I was confused in my mind, sometimes thinking of what Ungit by her own divine power might do to any mortal who thus stole her honor, and sometimes of what the priests and our enemies in the city might do with their tongues or stones or spears. Against the latter, the people's love for Psyche seemed to be a protection. That is, the priests might incite the people to violence, but they won't do anything as long as kind of we have Psyche on our side. But it didn't last for long. Why? Because the plague is still going on. The people are starving. Okay? So now what do they say? Now you don't need to send out your daughter to heal us. What? You need to send out your daughter as a sacrifice. So I'm going to skip a bunch. We're told now that Psyche is the accursed, page 38. Why do they call me the accursed? Who dared? Ariel says. And then it all comes out. And Psyche just, delivers all this stuff. But who cursed you, I asked. Well, nothing happened. Till I'd left nurse's home, and I passed, and well, there was a boy, a lovely boy, not 8 years old, who stared at me and spat on the ground. And he said, the accursed, she made herself a goddess. She is the curse itself. What did I do to them? Okay? What did I do to them? 2, you healed them and blessed them and took their filthy disease upon yourself, and these are their thanks. Okay, remember I said, this thing kind of has all of Lewis in it? You need your Christian illusions, your Christian, not allegory.
We're not there yet. We've got her getting tied to a tree.
Well, we've got a whole bunch. But yeah. Okay. You healed them, you blessed them, you took your filthy disease upon yourself, and what did they do? They cursed you. Okay? The king asks, because he's wondering what to do, page 41. He says that he's trapped. There's no way out. They will kill me by inches. What have I done that all these miseries should fall upon me? I've been a God-fearing man all my life. That's nothing but his way of saying, why me, God? Okay.
I gave those random sacrifices to the...
He gave his sacrifices. He followed Ungit, etc., etc. So what happens? They bring the priest in. Chapter 5. The priest comes in and he tells the king what's needed. Bulls and rams, page 45. Bulls and rams and goats will not win Ungit's favor while the land is impure. I've served Ungit these 63 years, and I've learned one thing for certain. Her anger never comes upon us without cause. And it never ceases without expiation. We've got to do something to win that expiation. Okay? He says no. Page 46, end of the big long paragraph. Ungit will be avenged. It's not a bull or a ram that will quiet her now. What does that mean? She wants man? Yes. Or woman. He's like, okay, I'll see about getting a captive. No. You don't understand. We must find the accursed. She or he must die by the right of the great offering. Can't be a thief. No. This is not to be a common sacrifice. We must make the great offering. The brute has been seen again. What's the brute? Okay. It's the first I've heard of it. It may be so. Kings seem to hear very little. They do not even know what goes on in their own palaces, but I hear. I lie awake in the nights, very long awake. I mean, this guy's kind of creepy.
Kind of.
I hear of terrible doings in this land. Arul looks at Redival. The king, the brute's a tale of my grandmother's. It may be, for it was in her time that the brute was last seen.
Did you ever see 300?
Yeah.
You know those really creepy old men who
Yes.
are at the Oracle? That's
Kind of.
This is this guy to a T.
Okay. So he says, the brute has been seen again, in fact, and many have seen it of late. Your own chief shepherd on the Grey Mountain saw it the night the first lion came. Big, black, terrible shape, blah, 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 blah. So, the fox intervenes. Why? Because he's going to get all Greek on him. In other words, let's slow down this conversation. He's going to play Socrates. Let's arrive at the truth. By the king's permission. Okay, page 48. The shepherd's tale is very questionable. If the man had a torch, of necessity the lion would have a big black shadow behind it. You cast the light, the lion's there, big shadow. The man was scared and knew wake from sleep. He took a shadow for a monster. That is the wisdom of the Greeks. But Glom does not take counsel with slaves. Many say it, the brute, is a shadow. Okay? What does that mean? If it is a shadow, then it's the shadow of something real. The shadows don't exist by themselves. But if that shadow begins coming down into the city, look to it yourself. You are of divine blood and doubtless fear nothing. But the people will fear. So, you'd be better to make the great offering. Okay, how do you do that? It is not done in the house of Ungit. The victim must be given to the brute, for the brute is, in a mystery, Ungit herself or Ungit's son, the god of the mountain, or both. So, the brute equals Ungit or her son or both. We're not really sure. That's why he says it's a great mystery. Okay? The victim is led up to the mountain, to the holy tree, and bound to the tree and left. Then the brute comes. In the great offering, the victim must be perfect. For in holy language, A man so offered is said to be Ungit's husband. So that if the brute comes and is Ungit, and a woman is said to be the bride of Ungit's son. So whoever gets offered, that determines kind of what it is that comes. If it's a woman, then it's Ungit's son. If it's a man, then Ungit is the one that comes. And what happens? And both are called the brute's supper. And when the brute is Ungit, it lies with the man, and when it is her son, it lies with the woman. And either way, there is a devouring. ... Many different things are said. ... Many sacred stories, 49. ... Many great mysteries. In other words, don't ask me to define this devouring. Why? Because it's a mystery. You can never apprehend the full meaning of it. How is it described? In stories. Some say the loving and the devouring are all the same thing. For in sacred language, we say that a woman who lies with a man devours the man. Not praying mantis-wise, like, If you don't know what that means, search up praying mantis copulation. So the king says, okay, speak on. Do you not see, master, said the fox, that the priest is talking nonsense? A shadow is to be an animal, which is also a goddess, which is also a god, and loving is to be eating. A child of 6 would talk more sense. Why? Because basic logic. A does not equal, A does not equal non-A. So, the brute can't be a person and simultaneously an animal and simultaneously a shadow. One thing cannot be more than one thing. Okay? A moment ago, the victim of this abominable sacrifice was to be the accursed, the wickedest person in the whole land, offered as punishment. Now, it's the best person in the whole land, the perfect victim, married to the god as a reward. Ask him what he means. It can't be both. Why not? Because logic says that doesn't work. But what if it can be both? What if it's not about logic at all? The priest. We are hearing much Greek wisdom this morning, and I've heard most of it before. It is very subtle, but it brings no rain and grows no corn. Sacrifice does both. It does not even give them who? Those to be sacrificed. Boldness to die. Or Greek wisdom. That Greek there is your slave, because in some battle he threw down his arms and let them bind his hands and lead him away and sell him, rather than take a spear thrust in his heart. In other words, his Greek wisdom turned him into a coward. Much less does it give them understanding of holy things. Real important part coming up. They, Greeks, Greek wisdom, Greek philosophy, rationalism, demand to see such things clearly, as if the gods were no more than letters written in a book. Okay? Listen to that again. They demand to see such things clearly, as if the gods were no more than letters written in a book. Okay. They demand to see such things clearly means what? Clearly how? Clearly from whose perspective? From their own, from ours. Well, how are things seen clearly by us? What must we have, first of all, to see things clearly.
Eyes.
Eyes that see things clearly. But what if they don't? What if we don't see clearly? What if we see what we think we see, or what we're used to seeing? And because we're used to seeing it, we gloss over what is strange or different or unusual. I, King, have dealt with the gods for 3 generations of men. I know that they dazzle our eyes and flow in and out of one another like eddies on a river. And nothing that is said clearly can be said truly about them. Why not? What does anything that's said come from?
Language. Or our minds.
Okay? Our language. Our minds. What's the problem when you experience something for which you don't have any words? Blah, 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 blah. You can't say anything. You can't put the experience into words. What does Ransom say about colors that he sees on Paralandra? It's kind of gold, but I've never seen any gold that really is close. Or green, it's just not quite green enough. There's a wonderful set of books written by an American. He lives in England now. He's lived there for 20 years or so, named Stephen Lawhead. And the series is called The Song of Albion. And it starts off set in Oxford. It ends up, in the first book, they go to the quote-unquote Celtic other world, okay, which is called Albion. And when the main character, Lewis, his name becomes Llw, takes on a Welsh character, when he wakes up in the Celtic otherworld, after he passes through essentially a portal, he goes through a burial cairn, he wakes up and he is suddenly amazed. Because the grass that he's laying on is greener than any grass he has ever seen. The sky is bluer than he has ever seen. The water, when he dips his face in a stream, is colder and wetter and more water-ish than any water he has ever experienced. Okay? And here's the reason why within the course of those novels. Because that Celtic otherworld is the world of which our world is kind of a copy or imitation. We're the shadow of the real thing, in other words. So our green, it's like a Xerox copy of green. Just not quite as rich in hue. I know that they dazzle our eyes and flow in and out of one another like eddies on a river, and nothing that is said truly can be said truly about them. Holy places are dark places. It is life and strength, not knowledge and words, that we get in them. Okay? It is life and strength, not knowledge and words. It's kind of interesting from a Protestant perspective. Okay, and keep in mind, Lewis was Protestant. Because what else can that mean? Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good, the psalmist writes. He doesn't say taste and know. Okay? When Christ gives the parable of the Last Judgment, he doesn't say to people, because of what you believed, because of what you knew, you will be separated onto my right side. He says, inasmuch as you have done it, you've given food, you've given water, you've given clothing, you've helped the poor, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Those are all actions. Holy wisdom is not clear and thin like water, but thick and dark like blood. Why should the accursed not be both the best and the worst? Well, how could it mean the worst? I'm not going to answer that, by the way. Just throw that out there. Okay. They keep kind of debating this, going back and forth. They cast lots. And the priest says, the lot said that the accursed is in your house. And the king's like, yeah, that figures. Okay. Keep going on. Go to page 54. We're going to take a break in just a moment. Page 54, right in the middle of the page. The worst was yet to come. The end of that paragraph. The room was full of spirits and the horror of holiness. It's like Ransom feeling the presence around him, or feeling that the space was packed. The father turns away from the priest and says, go on. The priest says, we asked whether it was the king who was the accursed. And the lot said, no. And the king is like, phew, thank Ungit for that. No, what? Go on. The lot fell on your youngest daughter, king. She is the accursed. Princess Istra must be the great offering. The king, it's very hard. Kind of like, darn. Well, okay, but if we must, And Arul passes out. Let's take a brief break. Say 5-10 minutes. Let's say 10 minutes, and come back because I want to try to get through all of this first section tonight, and let's see if we're able to.